If you've ever stood in a city during a blackout, you know the sound the world makes when systems fail. The electricity dies, the lights fade, and you suddenly realize how many things only work because everything else does. That's what the fall of Rome felt like. Not a bang, not an invasion, but a long, slow flicker, and then darkness. The year was 476 CE, and Rome was already a ghost of itself. The last emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, was more figurehead than ruler, a teenage placeholder in a collapsing bureaucracy. His father, the general Orestes, had put him on the throne after deposing the previous emperor. But Orestes' gamble failed when a Germanic warlord named Odoacer decided the game was over. He marched into Ravenna, the imperial capital since Rome had become too dangerous, and deposed the boy without ceremony. No massacres, no sacking, no grand finale. Just a memo to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople saying, essentially, you handle it now. It wasn't even called the Fall of Rome at the time. People just thought the paperwork was moving east. But in retrospect, that was the moment the lights went out in Western civilization. Rome didn't fall overnight because it had been falling for a long time. The empire's problems had been baked in by the 3rd century. Overextended borders, mercenary armies, corrupt officials, and the constant inflation that came from paying soldiers with debased coinage. The crisis of the 3rd century, between 235 and 284 CE, had already shattered any illusion of eternal order. In just 50 years, more than 20 emperors came and went, most assassinated by their own men. By the time of Diocletian's reforms, around 300 CE, the empire was less a united whole and more a stitched-together machine. Part military autocracy, part tax farm. Diocletian split it into eastern and western halves, appointing co-emperors to share the load. It worked on paper. In reality, it was a bureaucratic fever dream that barely held together. The western half was the weaker limb, poorer, more rural, constantly under threat. When Constantine the Great moved the capital east in 330 CE to found Constantinople, he might as well have carved the empire in two. The east became rich, urban, and Greek-speaking. The west became fragile, Latin, and overtaxed. By the 400s, the empire wasn't being conquered so much as scavenged. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked Rome in 410 CE, the first time the city had been taken in nearly 800 years. It shocked the ancient world. St. Augustine, writing in Hippo, modern Algeria, tried to make sense of it in the City of God. He said, Rome fell, but the City of God endures. In other words, stop worshiping empire. Start thinking about eternity. It was a comforting lie for a civilization in freefall. What really ended wasn't the politics. It was the infrastructure of continuity. When the roads stopped being repaired, trade collapsed. When the postal system dissolved, law fell apart. When the educated elite fled to their estates, literacy became a luxury. People could still build walls and fight wars, but the administrative knowledge, the civilizational glue, evaporated. By the 5th century, the population of Rome itself had dropped from over 1 million to maybe 30,000. Aqueducts broke and stayed broken. Grain shipments from Egypt stopped. The marble was stripped from temples to build defensive walls. The poet Sidonius Apollinaris, a Gallo-Roman aristocrat writing in the mid-400s, described the world with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief. He wrote letters to other nobles that sound like messages in a bottle, men still quoting Virgil while their cities burned. One of his lines reads, "The world grows old, yet fools we are to think our times are new." Outside the cities, rural life regressed by centuries. Pottery became crude, coinage disappeared, people bartered grain and labor again. In Britain, after the Roman legions withdrew in 410, literacy vanished completely within a generation. The Romano-British villas, once full of mosaics and wine, were abandoned to weeds and sheep. Archaeologists call it sub-Roman Britain. But that's a polite way of saying no one was writing things down anymore. And it wasn't just the West. The East, Byzantium, survived, but even it wasn't untouched. The historian Procopius, writing under Justinian I in the 6th century, recorded plagues, earthquakes, and wars so devastating that they sounded biblical. The plague of Justinian, 541 to 549 CE, wiped out nearly 1/3 of the Mediterranean population. Procopius wrote that bodies were piled like sacks of grain. When the grain stops moving, so does the world. What's fascinating about the so-called Dark Ages is that no one living in them thought they were dark. To them, the lights had just dimmed. The Romans had left ruins that still stood taller than anything their descendants could build. The Colosseum loomed like a dead god. The aqueducts stretched across valleys, broken but indestructible. Imagine being a 6th century peasant and walking through the bones of a world you couldn't possibly reconstruct. It must have felt like inheriting a spaceship and not knowing how to turn it on. Some of the best archaeology we have from this period comes from Lucca, York, and Trier, all once proud Roman towns. After 500 CE, we see fewer imported goods, less uniformity in pottery, and a complete end to centralized manufacturing. In short, the West forgot how to make stuff. The historian Peter Brown, in his book The World of Late Antiquity, argued that the idea of a total collapse is misleading. What we actually see is transformation. Roman order dissolving into smaller, regional cultures. But you can't romanticize that too much. Transformation is still painful when you're living through it. By the 6th century, cities like Rome, Arles, and Milan were depopulated. Their amphitheaters turned into fortresses. Senators who once debated tax policy were now hoarding gold under their villas. And religion, once a civic duty, became the only form of structure left. The church, in many ways, became the new empire. Bishops replaced governors. Monks became civil servants. Pope Gregory the Great, our 590 to 604 CE, used church funds to feed the poor and rebuild aqueducts. It's no coincidence that Gregory's pastoral rule reads less like theology and more like crisis management. And maybe this is the part of the story that feels eerily familiar. Civilizations rarely die in blood. They die in paperwork. They die when the spreadsheets stop updating, when the bridges go unrepaired, when the people who know how the systems work retire without replacements. The Romans didn't lose their empire because they forgot how to fight. They lost it because they forgot how to fix. By 500 CE, Europe was a patchwork of small kingdoms clinging to scraps of Roman order. Taxes turned to tribute. Law turned to custom. Knowledge turned to rumor. And still, amid the ruins, some people kept the lights burning. A few scholars, monks, and bureaucrats who refused to let memory die. That's the thing about collapse. There are always survivors. Always someone sitting in the dark, still writing, still teaching, still trying to remember how the world used to work. If you want to understand the Dark Ages, don't picture barbarians torching cities. Picture a scribe in a cold monastery in 520 CE, copying Cicero by candlelight. The empire was gone, but the word still made it across the centuries. Because civilization doesn't end when empires do. It ends when people stop believing knowledge is worth saving. After 476 CE, Europe didn't suddenly turn into some post-apocalyptic wasteland full of fur-clad marauders. It just got smaller. Trade routes closed like arteries after a heart attack, travel became dangerous, and knowledge that used to move freely through the empire now pooled in isolated pockets. It wasn't that people forgot how to live, they just stopped living together at scale. Take Britain. When the Roman legions pulled out in 410 CE, the island went from imperial outpost to abandoned experiment. Within decades, Roman towns like Londinium and Verulamium were reduced to squatter settlements. Imported pottery and coinage vanished from the archaeological record around 430 CE. Literacy disappears almost entirely. No one's engraving Latin inscriptions anymore. By the time the Anglo-Saxons arrive in the mid-5th century, the locals are recycling Roman bricks to build huts. A civilization that once maintained heated baths can't even produce roof tiles. On the mainland, Gaul fractured into tribal kingdoms. The Franks, led by Clovis I, began uniting northern Gaul around 481 CE, right as Rome's last emperor was being deposed. Clovis converted to Christianity around 496 CE, realizing that religion was the new diplomacy. His baptism gave him legitimacy the sword couldn't. In a Europe where the church was becoming the only functioning bureaucracy, that was political genius. Meanwhile, the Visigoths ruled Spain, the Ostrogoths took Italy, and the Vandals briefly held North Africa. These weren't cartoon barbarians. They admired Rome and wanted to inherit its prestige. They just didn't have the infrastructure to sustain it. Their kings wore Roman titles, minted Roman-style coins, and tried to speak Latin at court. They even kept Roman law, just rewritten to suit their tribes. But the engineers, architects, and administrators, the people who made Rome work, were gone. By the 6th century, Europe's cities had emptied out. Archaeological digs in France and Germany show entire Roman villas turned into farmland. The average house size shrinks dramatically, from multi-room stone homes to wooden one-room huts. Town populations drop from tens of thousands to a few hundred. In Northern Europe, the only stone buildings still being constructed are churches. Everything else returns to timber. And with smaller worlds came smaller horizons. Travel that once took weeks now took years, because the roads, those masterpieces of Roman engineering, were decaying. You couldn't rely on way stations or bridges anymore. Merchants stopped venturing far because brigandage replaced border control. A farmer in Gaul or Lombardy might never meet anyone who wasn't born within 20 miles. That's not ignorance, that's isolation. The historian Brian Ward Perkins called this the end of complexity. The supply chains that once connected quarries, workshops, and markets collapsed. Without long-distance trade, artisans lost both materials and customers. Pottery became local and crude, metalwork simplified, and large-scale construction ceased entirely. You can actually see this regression layer by layer in excavation sites. Fine, imported African red slipware suddenly replaced by rough, gray, hand-built bowls. Civilization doesn't vanish, it just downsizes. There was no postal system, no professional army, and no tax collector to complain about anymore. Instead of a world managed by clerks in Ravenna or Constantinople, you had local warlords collecting gifts. a polite word for protection money. Law was personal again, not written. If someone stole your cattle, you didn't file a report. You gathered your cousins. The one constant through all this shrinkage was the church. As the empire retreated, bishops filled the administrative vacuum. They kept birth records, distributed grain, mediated disputes, and maintained scraps of literacy. Monasteries became the archives of a vanishing civilization. It's not romantic piety that drove monks to copy manuscripts. It was disaster management. And the church had one enormous advantage: stability. While kingdoms rose and fell, the church had a network: monasteries, abbeys, scriptoria, stretching from Ireland to Sicily. When everything else went local, Rome's faith went global. Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century understood that if the empire couldn't save souls, maybe the church could save knowledge. The other holdout of civilization was Byzantium. In the east, Constantinople was thriving. Its population may have topped 500,000 when Rome's had fallen to 30,000. Its emperor, Justinian I, R. 527 to 565 CE, dreamed of reconquering the lost West, and nearly did. His general Belisarius retook North Africa from the Vandals in 534, then parts of Italy a few years later. But war and plague undid the victories. The plague of Justinian, which struck in 541 CE, killed perhaps 25 to 50 million people across the Mediterranean. One of the first recorded pandemics. The historian Procopius wrote that so many corpses filled Constantinople's streets that they were stacked in towers. When Justinian built the Hagia Sophia in 537 CE, its dome still standing today, it wasn't just a church, it was a statement. The empire isn't dead yet. And in the East, it really wasn't. The Byzantine bureaucracy, Greek scholarship, and Orthodox faith held together for nearly another 1,000 years. The irony is that while Europe descended into poverty, Byzantium kept the Roman lights on. Back in the West, people noticed. To a 6th century Frank or Lombard, Constantinople might as well have been a myth, a place of silk and marble where the emperor still ruled the world. The Byzantines called themselves Romans until the very end. The West called them Greeks. That semantic drift says everything about how far the worlds had split. This was the new Europe, fragmented, rural, suspicious of outsiders, terrified of famine and plague, and yet stubbornly alive. It's easy to call that darkness, but in those small, cold corners, the first sparks of the medieval world were forming. A culture that would later build cathedrals where Roman temples once stood. By the 7th century, Arabic merchants began sailing into the Mediterranean again. Trade flickered back to life. And in the far west, on the edges of the known world, monks in places like Iona and Lindisfarne were beginning to copy and illuminate the old books, not knowing they were rebuilding civilization one page at a time. Because when the world shrinks, what you save becomes the world. By the time the Western Empire was rubble and rumor, the people who kept civilization running weren't emperors or senators anymore. They were monks with bad handwriting. Civilization had become a candle in a cave, and it was being passed hand to hand, monastery to monastery, across the wreckage of Europe. Let's start at the edges, because that's where the light always survives first. On a cold, wind-battered island off the coast of Scotland, a man named Columba founded a monastery called Iona in 563 CE. It was small. A few huts, a chapel, and a library barely large enough to hold a dozen scrolls. But that tiny monastery would end up preserving some of the last remnants of Roman learning. From Iona, Columba's followers traveled south into Northumbria, founding Lindisfarne, the Holy Island. They copied books, educated priests, and spread Christianity not with swords, but with literacy. This was the start of what historians call the Insular Revival, a kind of intellectual aftershock in the British Isles. Monks in Ireland and Britain became accidental scholars, producing the Book of Kells, circa 800 CE, Lindisfarne Gospels circa 700 CE, and a network of scriptoria that treated ink and vellum as if they were sacred relics. These books weren't just Bibles. They were art, math, theology, and design all rolled together. Every swirl of ink was a statement, we remember. In continental Europe, another kind of preservation effort was underway. A Roman noble named Cassiodorus, who had served under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, retired from politics after Justinian's reconquest of Italy in the 530s turned the peninsula into a war zone. Instead of despairing, he built a monastery called Vivarium on his family estate in Calabria and turned it into a university of sorts. Cassiodorus believed copying books was as holy as prayer. He wrote, "Whoever copies a sacred text, by his hand teaches his tongue to speak again." His monks preserved not only scripture but classical texts, Cicero, Virgil, Aristotle, Pliny, the DNA of Roman thought. While monks in Europe were writing by candlelight, something extraordinary was happening further east. The Islamic Golden Age was beginning. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the Abbasid caliphs built a capital in Baghdad, and with it, an intellectual engine that would preserve and expand the wisdom of antiquity. By the 9th century, the House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, was translating Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics into Arabic. Scholars like al-Kindi, al-Farabi, and Hunayn ibn Ishaq didn't just copy. They corrected, debated, and improved on what they inherited. When Europe could barely afford ink, Baghdad had astronomers mapping the stars, doctors cataloging diseases, and mathematicians refining algebra. A word that literally comes from al-jabr, the reunion of broken parts. If there's poetry in history, that's it. A civilization in fragments, repaired through calculation. The conduit between these worlds was Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire that never fell. The Byzantines were meticulous archivists. In Constantinople, scribes kept libraries of pagan and Christian texts alike. The Emperor Justinian's legal code, compiled between 529 and 534 CE, became the backbone of modern European law. His historian, Procopius, gave us the gossip version of the era in The Secret History, half expose, half miracle record. And the city's scholars, men like John Philipponus and Michael Psellos, carried the torch of Greek philosophy through centuries of theological debate. If Rome's fall had scattered civilization, Byzantium and the caliphates were stitching it back together, text by text. It's easy to imagine Europe as an island in darkness, but the truth is more like an archipelago, small pockets of light connected by trade, pilgrimage, and stolen books. By the 8th century, that light began creeping back into Europe proper. A Northumbrian monk named Bede, working in the monastery of Jarrow, wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people in 731 CE, the first attempt to tell England's story in Latin prose. He also calculated the age of the Earth, mapped eclipses, and proposed the use of Anno Domini dating, which we still use today. Bede was a product of both Roman discipline and Christian patience, proof that ideas could outlive the empires that birthed them. At the same time, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was beginning to realize that power without literacy was fragile. When he became emperor of the Romans in 800 CE, he made a point of surrounding himself with scholars. His favorite was an Anglo-Saxon monk named Alcuin of York, who built schools, standardized Latin grammar, and reintroduced handwriting that was legible again. You can thank him for lowercase letters. Carolingian minuscule was his invention. Charlemagne's court became the nucleus of the Carolingian Renaissance, not a full rebirth, but a revival. Scribes copied thousands of manuscripts, many of which would otherwise have been lost forever. By 850 CE, scriptoria from Aachen to Tours were mass-producing books, religious, historical, and philosophical. Europe's candle was burning brighter again. But the real brilliance of this era isn't just in what was preserved. It's in how these scattered efforts formed a network. A monk in Ireland, a scholar in Baghdad, and a bureaucrat in Constantinople were all, in their own ways, working on the same problem: how to stop the world from forgetting itself. When historians talk about the Dark Ages, they tend to focus on what was lost: the art, the architecture, the armies. But what's more remarkable is how much wasn't lost. Roughly 90% of the classical Latin texts we have today were copied by monks between the 6th and 9th centuries. Every page of Livy, Ovid, and Tacitus you've ever read survived because some exhausted monk in an unheated stone cell decided the words were worth saving. There's something profoundly human about that, a species too stubborn to let silence have the last word. And maybe that's the real definition of civilization. Not luxury or empire, but continuity. The ability to remember through interruption. If you had wandered through Western Europe around the year 800 CE, it wouldn't have looked much like Rome. No marble forums, no aqueducts humming with water, no philosophers holding court in the open air. But something new was growing in the ashes: order. Not the polished order of empire, but the rough, pragmatic kind, born out of exhaustion and necessity. That change had a name: Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. When he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800 CE, inside the old Basilica of St. Peter's, Europe took its first awkward step out of the fog. It wasn't a rebirth of Rome, not really. It was more like a medieval remix. Part faith, part force, and part nostalgia for a world too big to imagine rebuilding. But it worked, at least for a while. Charlemagne's empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. He couldn't read or write himself, but he understood that civilization ran on ink as much as on iron. He surrounded himself with scholars like Alcuin of York, Paulinus of Aquileia, and Theodulf of Orleans, men who had studied in Irish and Italian monasteries and brought with them something priceless: literacy. They created what's now called the Carolingian Renaissance, a period not of invention, but of recovery. Schools were founded in monasteries and cathedrals. Latin was standardized so people from Spain to Saxony could at least understand each other's prayers. And manuscripts were copied by the thousands. To make them readable, Alcuin devised a new script, Carolingian minuscule, the ancestor of our lowercase letters and spaces between words. If you've ever read a book without having to guess where one word ends and the next begins, you can thank an 8th century monk. Charlemagne didn't rebuild the empire's grandeur. He rebuilt its connective tissue. Roads were repaired, tolls standardized, trade revived. Silver coins bearing his name circulated across Europe, signaling a kind of trust that hadn't existed in centuries. He issued capitularies, royal decrees, on everything from weights and measures to education. One reads almost comically practical, that every bishop and abbot shall see that schools be established. It wasn't lofty, it was logistics. But logistics are what makes civilization stand. Beneath the pomp of imperial coronations, something deeply modern was happening. Europe was learning how to manage information again. Monks in scriptoria acted like servers in a network, copying, storing, distributing. The Palatine Chapel in Aachen, Charlemagne's capital, became a hub of both faith and administration. It still stands today, its octagonal dome borrowed from Byzantine architecture. A physical bridge between the world that was and the world being built. Of course, stability was fragile. After Charlemagne's death in 814 CE, his grandsons divided the empire, arguing themselves into weakness. By the mid-9th century, Europe fractured again, and a new wave of chaos arrived. The Vikings. From Lindisfarne in 793 CE to Paris in 845, Norse longships slithered up rivers that had once carried Roman trade. Monasteries, those fragile archives of civilization, were looted and burned. Monks hid manuscripts in walls or fled inland with whatever books they could carry. Yet, the Vikings weren't just destroyers. Many settled, traded, and eventually converted. By the 10th century, they were founding kingdoms in Normandy and Dublin, integrating into the same order they once threatened. Europe absorbed its invaders as the way forests absorb fire. Painfully, but with new growth. In the south, the Islamic world was at its peak. Córdoba in Al-Andalus, modern Spain, was one of the most advanced cities on earth. With paved roads, public baths, and libraries rumored to hold over 400,000 manuscripts. Compare that to the largest library in Western Europe at the time, which might have owned 500. Scholars like Averroes and Maimonides were debating Aristotle while most Europeans still believed the world ended at the Pyrenees. But those ideas didn't stay locked in the Mediterranean. Through Sicily, Venice, and the Crusader states, Arabic texts began trickling back into Europe, bringing algebra, astronomy, and the philosophy of the Greeks, preserved through Arabic. In Toledo, Spain, translators like Gerard of Cremona and Michael Scott began converting those Arabic manuscripts into Latin during the 12th century. The chain went Greece to Byzantium to Baghdad, to Toledo to Paris. Civilization had gone around the world to find itself again. Meanwhile, the church continued its bureaucratic expansion. Monasteries became Europe's think tanks and banks, copying texts, managing land, lending money, running hospitals. Orders like the Benedictines and Cistercians turned faith into infrastructure. The phrase ora et labora, pray and work, wasn't poetic, it was a management philosophy. By the 11th century, the economy began to stir. Markets reappeared, trade routes revived, and cities grew fat on commerce again. Venice and Genoa became the new maritime powers, ferrying goods between Europe and the East. In northern France, the Champagne fairs connected merchants from Flanders to Italy. You could finally buy spices again, or sell wool, or commission art. Money was moving, and so were ideas. Architecture reflected the shift. Churches grew taller, windows larger. The Romanesque style, heavy and fortress-like, gave way to Gothic, a structure of light and air. The Abbey of Cluny, founded 910 CE, symbolized Europe's new confidence. Vast, orderly, disciplined. It was a monument to the belief that faith could organize the world again. But beneath the cathedrals and coinage, something quieter was taking root. Curiosity. When Anselm of Canterbury wrote Proslogion in the late 11th century, trying to prove God's existence through reason, he was doing something dangerous. He was thinking like a philosopher again. By the 12th century, cathedral schools in Chartres, Paris, and Bologna were teaching logic, rhetoric, and natural philosophy. The university was being born. The thing about the Dark Ages, they were never actually dark. The term was coined in the 14th century by the Italian scholar Petrarch, who imagined himself standing in a kind of dawn after a long night. The Renaissance looking back at the ruins and declaring itself the light. He wasn't wrong that something had been lost. He was just wrong about who had been holding the candles. For the better part of 1,000 years, Europe was rebuilding from the ground up, not in marble, but in patience. Farmers became masons, monks became engineers, and illiterate warriors became kings who founded universities. It's easy to say they lived in shadow, but those shadows were cast by the fires they built. The so-called fall of Rome wasn't a cliff, it was a slope. Civilization slid, but it never stopped moving. And when we look closely, the narrative of darkness collapses under its own simplicity. The Byzantine Empire was thriving. The Abbasid Caliphate was producing breakthroughs in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. In China, the Tang and Song dynasties were printing books and inventing gunpowder. The darkness existed only where we forgot to look. By the 13th century, the very monks who had once copied scripture in silence were now debating Aristotle in Paris. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas were taking Greek philosophy, filtered through Arabic translations, and weaving it into theology. You had this wild intellectual fusion, Christian metaphysics built on pagan logic preserved by Muslim scholars. The world had reconnected its own scattered neurons. And that's the real story of the Middle Ages. Not ignorance, but recovery. Civilization didn't die. It learned to adapt to scarcity. It remembered how to remember. Still, there's a reason the Dark Ages myth endures. We love a clean story. Rise, fall, rebirth. It makes history feel manageable, like we're watching seasons change instead of living inside them. But the truth is messier. Collapse isn't cinematic. It's slow, bureaucratic, and boring. Roads rot. Letters stop arriving. People stop asking big questions because they're busy staying alive. It's not fire and ruin. It's silence and paperwork. And that's where the modern echo begins. When Rome fell, the world lost its network, its roads, its mail, its record-keeping, its infrastructure of trust. It wasn't the buildings that mattered. It was the system. The aqueducts didn't just move water, they moved certainty. The moment they cracked, every other promise followed. Today, our aqueducts are invisible. They hum beneath our feet and behind our screens. The servers, the fiber optics, the grids that feed our cities. We think of collapse as something that happens to other people in the past. But we're as dependent on complexity as Rome ever was, and just as confident that it will last forever. Imagine a historian from the year 3000 scrolling through our ruins, assuming they still have power to scroll. What would they see? Not burned libraries, but blank screens. Lost archives, not because of conquest, but because a data center flooded or a password was forgotten. In Rome's day, literacy died one generation at a time. Ours could vanish in a single EMP. And like the Romans, We're not great at noticing decay until it's terminal. They watched their roads crumble and called it normal. We watch our institutions do the same and call it politics. When supply chains snap, when information silos deepen, when people stop trusting their own networks, those are modern ruins. You don't need an invading army when entropy does the work for free. But maybe that's why the so-called Dark Ages still matter, because they remind us how fragile the light is and how stubbornly people can rebuild it. Europe's recovery didn't come from emperors. It came from monks copying books they didn't fully understand, from farmers who kept plowing through famine, from traders who risked seas for a handful of silver. Civilization isn't sustained by brilliance. It's sustained by effort. The 12th century scholar Hugh of Saint-Victor once wrote, "The man who finds his homeland sweet is still a tender beginner. He to whom every soil is as his native one is already strong, but he is perfect to whom the entire world is as a foreign land." He was describing the monk's pilgrimage, but he could just as easily have been describing history itself. We move, we forget, we rediscover, we begin again. When people talk about the end of the world, they usually mean the end of comfort. The Romans probably thought the same thing, that civilization couldn't survive without marble or empire or hot baths. But the truth is, the world doesn't end. It just becomes something else. The Dark Ages weren't the death of civilization. They were its adolescence, messy, awkward, defiant, and alive. And maybe that's where we are now. Our cathedrals are data centers. Our monasteries are servers. Our scribes are programmers. But the fragility is the same. The assumption that progress is permanent. The Romans thought their aqueducts would run forever. We think the cloud will. History disagrees. But here's the hopeful part. When the lights went out in Rome, they didn't go out everywhere. They went out unevenly, flickering across the map like dying embers. And in those embers, people built again. Not because they had a plan, but because they refused to live without stories, without calendars, without meaning. Civilization has always been rebuilt by those who couldn't stand the dark. History has never really been a line. It's a heartbeat. Civilizations rise, stutter, collapse, and start again. Not because they forget, but because remembering takes work. The Romans built in stone and thought it would last forever. The monks built in ink and ended up outlasting them. Maybe that's the lesson. That endurance isn't about strength, it's about stubbornness. The kind that keeps a candle burning when no one's left to see it. So if every age eventually becomes a dark one, maybe the point isn't to stop the night from falling. Maybe it's to leave enough light behind that someone, somewhere, can find their way back. Until next time, I'll see you later.